Tonight, in the first hour, we will cover the history of the period of the two kingdoms, the kingdom of the north, Israel, the kingdom of the south, Judah. And we will see other personalities, particularly some of the prophets and their place in that history. In the second hour, the Lord granting that my throat will hold out, we will look at a few of the prophets that preached in the early time, what we know as the writing prophets. We have seen in the last hour together how that David grew spiritually through very difficult times. And even though David was a sinner, he knew how to deal with his sin. He knew how to confess his sin to the Lord and seek God's forgiveness. As the book of 1 Kings opens, David is still on the throne, but he is very near death. Once more he is plagued by a rebellious son. Adonijah exalted himself and tried to have himself declared king. This time he had such men as Joab, and Abiathar the priest with him, men who before had always backed David, but men who apparently did not like Solomon. When Adonijah declared himself king and sought to take over, it was Nathan the prophet who had rebuked David for his sin, who came now to Bathsheba because David was quite near death. Bathsheba, the wife of David, the former wife of Uriah the Hittite, had borne to him Solomon, and David had promised that Solomon would be his successor. So Nathan went to the wife of David and said that she should go to David and tell him what was going on, or soon the kingdom would be lost to Solomon. David responded. He called the people that he had trusted most, told them to get up and to go ahead and crown Solomon king, even though David was still alive. At this, the followers of Adonijah just disappeared. They were not able to withstand David's command. David called Solomon. We read in chapter 2, he said, "I'm going the way of all the earth. I'm going to die. But you be strong and show yourself a man. Keep the charge of the Lord your God to walk in his ways and keep his statutes and testimonies. Uphold the written law of Moses, and you will prosper in all you do." The promise of David to Solomon was similar to the promise of God to Joshua long before. Be faithful to God's word, and you will prosper. With this, David died, having reigned for 40 years, and Solomon took over. Now, when Solomon took over the reins of the government, immediately he began to show some serious weaknesses. First thing we learn in chapter 3 is that he made an alliance with the king of Egypt and sealed that alliance by marrying Pharaoh's daughter, a thing God had forbidden, had warned the people never to do. The scripture says that Solomon loved the Lord and began by walking in the statutes of David, but that he also practiced offering burnt offerings in high places, which God had forbidden. God had said, "You will worship only at the altar I have designated, the one at the tabernacle." But Solomon by these actions, showed that there were serious weaknesses in his own spiritual character. In a dream one evening, Solomon dreamed that God had asked him what he could give him, and Solomon's answer was, "Give me an understanding heart to discern, to judge my people. Give me wisdom." And God's response was, "I will give you not only that, but a long life and great riches. If you will walk in my ways and keep my statutes, as your father David did, then I will lengthen your days." Now Solomon arose, he woke up the next morning, and it was a dream. He took the dream seriously. God began to give him wisdom. He became known for both his wealth and his wisdom. We read of both in chapter 4. Solomon ruled over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates River to the land of the Philistines and border of Egypt, and all of these nations brought him tribute. Now we should say that David had conquered these lands. David had never been able to enjoy the benefits of his conquest, but he established a strong kingdom. Solomon simply took it over and began to reap the riches of the results of his father's labors. Verse 29 of chapter 4 tells us that God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding so that he excelled all others. These are positive things regarding the man, but we also see some negatives. In 5:13 we read that Solomon raised a levy out of all Israel. That means that he practiced forced labor. He did something no other king had done, neither Saul nor David. He forced the citizens of Israel to work, to labor for the government in hard tasks, in hard physical work. We read in chapter 6 that thing for which Solomon is well known, the building of the temple. God had told David that he was not to build the temple. David told Solomon that he must, and he laid it before him as the greatest challenge of his life. So Solomon did complete what David had begun. David had gathered together all the materials and hired the skilled laborers to build. Solomon simply commanded and oversaw the building itself. That itself is good, but when we read in chapter 7 that Solomon built his own house and it was several times as large as God's house, that he spent nearly twice as much time building his house as he did the house of the Lord, and then we begin to see again something of the weakness of Solomon's character. He was willing to honor God up to a point, but he honored himself much more. Chapter 8 tells of the dedication of the house of God, and here we find recorded one of the most beautiful prayers. Solomon knew how to pray. He prayed eloquently in a moving manner. And in the end, God said, in essence again, "If you're faithful, then I will indeed bless this house." But God gave a warning to Solomon, which we read in 9:4. "As for you, if you will walk before me as David your father, in integrity of heart and uprightness, then I will establish the throne of your kingdom forever, as I promised David. But if you turn away from following me, and you do not keep my commandments, then I will cut off Israel out of the land, and this house which you have built and I have sanctified, I will cast out of my sight. I will destroy it. As we move on toward the latter part of Solomon's life, we find in chapter 11 that King Solomon loved many foreign women. The pattern of marrying Pharaoh's daughter was followed by marrying the princesses of many other lands, the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, Hittites. Not only that, but he brought their gods into the city of Jerusalem. He allowed them to worship them, and he even built temples for them. God had warned, you shall not go among these people. They will surely turn your heart away. But Solomon cleaved to them in great love toward these pagan women. The Bible simply says his heart was not perfect, as was his father David's. He went after the various gods and goddesses. He followed all the abominations of the Canaanite lands. Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. It's hard for us to comprehend how this man who had such great promise in the beginning could have turned so completely away from God. It's also hard to estimate the damage that did to the history of Israel, because Israel would never be the same again. The Lord was angry with Solomon because he turned away from the Lord with his heart. He did not keep the commandments of the Lord. He said, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant. But he said, I will not take it all from you for the sake of David, my servant. So God said, because of your wickedness, you deserve to lose the kingdom entirely. And your children deserve to be totally rejected. But I will not do that. Not because of you, Solomon, but because of your father. Because he did honor me and he was faithful, and I made him a promise. Thus we see that the consequence of Solomon's sinful life and the great turn in his life away from God was that all Israel was greatly affected. No longer would Israel be one nation of 12 tribes. It would be a divided kingdom. There would be a northern kingdom of Israel and a southern kingdom of Judah. And after Solomon's death, this would begin. Now, the one that God raised up to oppose Solomon was Jeroboam, who was described in chapter 11 as a servant of Solomon. But he led a rebellion against Solomon, and he tried to get some of the things changed that Solomon was doing. But Solomon would not listen to Jeroboam. So the Lord came to Jeroboam, we're told in chapter 11, and said, I will be with you and build you a sure house as I built David's. I will give Israel to you, the northern kingdom. And I will for this afflict the seed of David, but not forever. In other words, God was saying to Jeroboam, if you will obey and honor me, then I will bless you as I blessed David. It was an unparalleled opportunity for this young ruler. When Solomon heard of it, he tried to kill Jeroboam, but Jeroboam was able to escape. Now, as Solomon was about to die, or did die, all Israel turned to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, to make him king. And as Rehoboam took over the kingship, he went to the older men in the followers of his father David and Solomon, he went to these wiser ones that had stood before Solomon his father and counseled him. And they said to him, if you will be a servant to this people, and if you will do good to them, then they will follow you, and you will have a successful reign. But we're told that Rehoboam, like his father, was stubbornly foolish, and he turned away from the counsel of the older advisors, and he turned to his own generation, the young men that he grew up with. And they said, you make it even harder on the people than your father Solomon did. You show them who's in charge. Rehoboam liked that, and he did that, and so Israel rebelled. Jeroboam led the rebellion against the house of David, and he said, we have no future with the house of David, and we will declare ourselves a new kingdom. Now the problem is that though God had given this kingdom to Jeroboam and had told him if he was faithful then God would bless him, Jeroboam did not trust God. We read in the 12th chapter, the 26th verse, that Jeroboam said in his heart, the kingdom will return to the house of David if this people go and offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem. He could foresee that as the people yearly went back to Jerusalem to worship, gradually they would come back into the kingdom of Judah, and he would be left without a kingdom. So Jeroboam drove out all of the priests, the Levites in the northern kingdom. He replaced them with his own self-appointed priest. He developed his own sacrificial system, his own ritual. In other words, he threw over the law of Moses entirely and sought to build a kingdom on his own strength. For this reason, Jeroboam is known in the history of Israel as the king who made Israel to sin. We read out of it in chapter 13 at the end. Jeroboam did not return from his evil way, but made again from among the people priests. Whosoever would consecrate himself there might be a priest. And this became sin to the house of Jeroboam, and in the end it would be cut off. God sent a prophet to Jeroboam, the first king of Israel, the northern kingdom, and said to him, the Lord will raise up a king over Israel who will cut off the house of Jeroboam. Jeroboam, your kingdom will not last long, just a few generations, and it will be gone. So Jeroboam, by trying to secure his kingdom and the future of his kingdom, in fact, brought its quick demise. Soon it would be no more. Now the kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom, was no better. The successors of Solomon, Rehoboam, and Abijam, his son, were no better than Jeroboam. But we're told in chapter 15 that nevertheless, for David's sake, the Lord gave him a lamp in Jerusalem. That means that because of the promises he made to a faithful David, God did not let the lamp of David go out. He did not let spiritual righteousness disappear from the southern kingdom. Among the kings there would be some who would be faithful. In the south, in the northern kingdom, there was never one king that pleased God. Now there were many faithful prophets. There were many faithful individuals. But not one single king in the northern kingdom was faithful. The next few chapters trace for us the rather rapid decline of Israel. There were rebellions and overthrows and a sequence of replaced kings because no one was able to establish a stable kingdom in the northern kingdom. Until finally, as we're told in chapter 15, or 16 rather, there arose a man named Omri who was very powerful. And he organized a following that made him king in Israel. Now, so influential and impressive was the man Omri that in the lands around there, the archaeological record shows that the Assyrians and Babylonians and others that were just themselves beginning to grow in this period refer to Israel as Omri land. Long after Omri had died, they called Israel Omri land, which would speak to the greatness of this man in the military sense, but he was a great sinner too. He had a son named Ahab who succeeded him. We read in chapter 16 that Ahab crowned his sin by marrying Jezebel, the daughter of a Baal-worshiping king. And it was Jezebel, the wife of Ahab, who brought Baal worship into Israel at this time. To give some idea of the sinfulness of this time, when Jericho had fallen, Joshua had pronounced a curse on any man that ever rebuilt it. For all those years, Jericho had just stayed in rubble. But now in these times of Ahab and Jezebel, a man dared to rebuild the city, and as Joshua had warned, his firstborn and his youngest son died as a penalty for having built back that city God had cursed. It's in this context that suddenly one of the great prophets of the Old Testament appears, Elijah. The name Elijah itself means, "My God is the Lord." And whether he was named that as a child by his parents or whether he took that name in order to let the people know where he stood, Elijah suddenly appeared on the scene. He walked into the court of Ahab and he said, "It will not rain by the power of God until I say so." And he turned around and walked out. Now we can imagine that the people in the court of the king laughed at such a man, unheard of, walking in, making such a declaration. "It will only rain by my word." But in fact, months turned into years and it didn't rain, and a terrible famine came on the whole land. Ahab got angrier and angrier, and he tried to find Elijah, but Elijah was living in another place, hidden. And finally God said to Elijah, "It's time for you to go back to Ahab." So Elijah returned, and as Ahab saw him, he said, "It is you, you troubler of Israel." And Elijah's answer is a classic. He said, "It is not I who have troubled Israel, but you and your father's house, in that you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baalim." In other words, he was bold to say to the king, "All the trouble in Israel is due to you and your father and the wickedness that you have done." Elijah challenged the priest of Baal to a contest. They would meet on Mount Carmel, and there both would build an altar, the priest and prophets of Baal, and then Elijah alone. The contest would be that the God that answered by fire, that is, who burned up the offering, they would not apply fire, but the God who spoke and answered by fire would be the true God. And he said, if it be the Lord, then follow the Lord. If it be Baal, then follow Baal. But stop this wavering back and forth. The people were apparently claiming on the one hand to be followers of the Lord, but on the other hand they were bowing to the wishes of Jezebel and also worshiping Baal. Elijah won the contest. There was no contest. The Baal worshipers tried all day and they couldn't get their Baal god to answer by fire. When they were done at the end of the day, it was Elijah who prayed to God, asked that he show the people, so that the hearts of the people would be turned back to God, that this great sign would turn the people back to God. Well, God responded, and not only was the offering, but the water around it that Elijah had poured on, and then the very stones were all consumed in the fire. And all the people cried out in unison, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." It would seem that Elijah had won the contest. But as we read on in the 19th chapter, we find that Jezebel, when she heard what had happened, and that Elijah had not only defeated and embarrassed, but also had put to death many of her priests, she said, "So help me, I will get even with Elijah, and he'll be as those priests and prophets he killed." Suddenly Elijah found himself public enemy number one in the kingdom. And he found that all those people who had said, "The Lord, He is God," were silent. Elijah felt defeated. He retreated all the way back to Sinai, way out in the wilderness. He said, "Lord, I'm not worthy to live. Let me die. I'm an utter failure." But it was there at Sinai that the Lord showed him something. We read it in chapter 19 that a great wind passed by, but the Lord was not in the wind. Then a great earthquake shook, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. Then a great fire like the one that had come down from heaven, but the Lord was not there either. And after this, a still small voice. Well, it seems apparent that what the Lord was teaching him was what we've noted before, that the hearts of people will never be changed by miracles. People seeing miracles will never come to faith in God. The only thing that will change their hearts is the still small voice of the preaching of God's prophets, as they preach as God's voice speaks to their hearts. Elijah was reassured by the Lord that he was not alone, that there were still 7,000 in Israel that had not bowed the knee to Baal. The rest of the book of Kings tells us about the ministry of Elijah, tells us how he prepared and began a school for the prophets, which apparently became the means by which God raised up and had his prophets trained. And Elijah instituted this school of the prophets and got its start. In the meantime, again, focuses on Ahab. One day he saw a vineyard that was owned, who was an inheritance of a man named Naboth, and he wanted that vineyard which was near his house. He tried to buy it from Naboth, and Naboth refused, saying, "No, it would not be right for me to sell my inheritance to you." Ahab was really a weak king. He turned his face to the wall and wept because he couldn't get his way. Jezebel was no weakling. When she saw her husband crying and found out why, she said, "Well, you're the king, you can take it." She let word get out that this man Naboth was in rebellion against God and ought to be put to death. And Naboth was killed and his vineyard taken, and God sent the prophet to him and warned him that the kingdom would shortly be taken from Ahab. One of the sad accounts in this occasion was that Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah at this time, made an alliance with Ahab. There had been war between the southern and northern kingdoms, but Jehoshaphat, who was basically a good king, trying to be faithful to God, nevertheless allied with Ahab, the wicked king who had stolen Naboth's vineyard, to go to war against a common enemy. Not only that, but the alliance ultimately included that Jehoshaphat's son should marry the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel, and this would eventually bring Baal worship into Judah. So Jehoshaphat, though seeking to be true to God, made some serious compromises that in the end would nearly bring Judah down. Well, the two kings went to war, and Ahab said, "Now, I'm going to dress just like a common soldier, and you dress like a king, because if they see me, they'll kill me." Now, Jehoshaphat somehow didn't get the picture that if they saw him as the king, they would think he was Ahab and kill him. And they nearly did. After this, Jehoshaphat was a bit reluctant to make any more alliances with Ahab. In the end, Ahab was killed in that battle, and Jehoshaphat learned a hard lesson. This brings us to 2 Kings. As Elijah was featured in 1 Kings, Elisha, his successor, is featured in the early part of 2 Kings. Elijah himself was told by God that he was going to be taken from earth, that God was going to take him directly into heaven, that he would not die but go to heaven. Elisha, who had been close to Elijah all these years, was the one to whom Elijah would pass the mantle, literally. Then later on, that term came to mean anyone who passes on his leadership to another. So we're told that Elijah was taken up in a chariot of fire and horses. He was taken up actually in a whirlwind, but there was the appearance of a chariot of fire and of horses. And Elisha saw his leader taken up, and he cried out, my father, the chariots of Israel and the horsemen," by which he meant that Elijah had proven to be more strength and more good for Israel than all the armies of all the kings of Israel. Now Elisha began to show his leadership. There are a number of great miracles that were worked through Elisha by God. We're also told in the 4th chapter that there was a great woman who lived in one of the cities where Elisha often traveled, and she offered him bread whenever he passed through. And finally, in verse 10, she offered him a little chamber with a bed and a table and a seat and a candlestick. With this, she provided the first prophet's chamber. From that time, since then, as God's servants have gone throughout the world, there have been many who have been provided a place to stay in their travels. Many of you have offered me what might be called a prophet's chamber. And you've equipped it a little better. There's more than a candle and a stool and a bed. And I thank you for your Christian love and warm hospitality. This same woman lost her child in death. And when Elisha learned of it and came, and he prayed for that child, he prayed unto the Lord, and the child was revived. One interesting thing about this miracle, of course, in the New Testament, we see the miracles of Jesus and how he raised people from the dead and how he did many mighty works. But one thing that we must observe, when the prophets did any miracles, they did them in the name of God. They did them, that is, that God might receive all the glory. But Jesus never did anything in the name of anyone but himself, which shows us the difference between the servant through God being able to do miracles, or more correctly, God through the servant doing miracles, and Jesus Christ, who was God, and by his own pronouncements, Lazarus, rise and come forth. He didn't pray to God, he just announced, come forth, showing that he was indeed God. After this, we have the account of Naaman's leprosy. Naaman was the general of Syria's army. He had leprosy. After he captured some Israelites, a little girl told him that there was a man in Israel that could heal his leprosy, and he went and found that man was Elisha, and he went to Elisha, and Elisha said, go wash in one of the streams here, and the man was indignant. He said, I came all this way to wash in one of your streams, and I could have washed in a far greater river than this in my land of Syria. But his servant was wiser, and he said, now you came this far, and Elisha told you what to do it. He did it, and his leprosy was healed. He sought to reward Elisha. Elisha would take nothing. But Elisha had a servant named Gehazi, and he had greed. He went after Naaman and said, well, Elisha's changed his mind and said you could give a reward if you want to. And so Gehazi thought that he had cleverly gotten something for himself. After all, Elisha didn't want it. Why shouldn't he have it? When he returned to his master Elisha, Elisha said, do you not know that I was with you and saw exactly what you did? For that the leprosy of Naaman will be on you. And so the career of Gehazi ended. Again, Elisha with one of his servants was up on a hill, and he was being told by God everything that the king of Syria was planning. The king of Syria learned from his own soldiers that he would never be able to defeat Israel because Elisha knew everything the Syrians were planning. So the king of Syria sent one group of soldiers after another to capture this terrible man, and each one of them were devoured by fire, destroyed. God protected Elisha and his servant, and reassured them that the king of Syria would not be able to harm him, because they that are with us are more than they that are with them. And he asked God to open his servant's eyes, and he did, and he saw that God had indeed surrounded the mountain with God's own people. As we trace through these chapters, we find that Elisha's work was about done. Before he was finished, he chose Jehu to be king over Ahab. Jehu overthrew Ahab the king and killed Ahab, killed Jezebel, that is, and wiped out the whole kingdom of Ahab. And Jehu then proceeded to wipe out all the Baal worshipers. He gathered them all together to say that he was going to worship Baal. But when they were all together, he utterly destroyed every one of them and wiped Baal worship out from Israel. But in spite of this thing he did at the command of God, Jehu proved to be no better than Ahab, whom he had replaced. We said earlier that in Judah, the son of Jehoshaphat had married the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. And as a result of this, we find that Baal worship was brought into the kingdom. And Athaliah, the daughter of Jezebel, determined that she would take over the kingdom of Judah. When her husband died, she tried to have every single one of the sons of David, the descendants of David, the royal line, destroyed. She destroyed all but one. Jehoiada the prophet, in those days, the priest in the temple, protected little Joash, the only survivor, until he was old enough to be crowned king. And at that point, then the Lord did raise up Joash. Jehoiada brought him out. Joash was announced king. And the wicked queen who had tried to take over after her husband's death, she herself was put to death. But that did not rid Judah of Baal worship, and it would continue to plague Judah down till the days of the fall of that people. In 13, we read of Elisha's death. We read further of God's continuing to protect both Israel and Judah from their enemies for the sake of David, not for the sake of the kings of those lands. In chapter 15, we learn of the reign of Uzziah, who is also known as Azariah. He reigned 52 years in Judah, and it was one of the most prosperous times of Judah's history. At the same time, the last great king in the northern kingdom of Israel, Jeroboam II, was reigning. And after him, there would be nothing but weak kings until finally Samaria fell. We read in chapter 17 of the fall of Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom, and the Assyrians destroyed that land. The reason they came in and destroyed the northern kingdom was twofold. First of all, Ahaz, one of the wicked kings of Judah, when threatened by his enemies, hired the Assyrians to come against his enemies, the northern kingdom and the kingdom of Syria. In spite of the fact that Isaiah had said to him, because this is the time of Isaiah the prophet, Isaiah had said, "Don't worry about these threats. Trust in God, he will deliver you." But Ahaz would not. He hired the Assyrians to attack the northern kingdom of Israel, and they did, as we read here in chapter 17. But the other reason why Assyria attacked was that God himself was fed up with the northern kingdom. Because of their exceeding great sinfulness, we read in verse 7, "Because the children of Israel sinned against the Lord their God, who brought them out of Egypt, because they would not do what was right in his sight, but turned to the gods of the pagans around them, Even though God sent to them prophet after prophet, calling them to turn from their evil ways, because they refused to believe in the Lord, that is why the kingdom of Israel fell. The king of Assyria left in the place of all the Israelites that he carried away, and they were never heard from again. They're lost in history. We never know any more about all the people that lived in Israel, the northern kingdom. They were just simply carried away and lost. But he brought in some people from other lands and settled them there, and they became known in history as the Samaritans. And these Samaritans were a people who feared the God of Israel, the God who had been the God of that land, but they worshiped their own gods at the same time. And so eventually they became a mixture of people that knew something about the true God but did not believe in him. And they were still in existence in the days of Jesus' ministry on earth. And in fact, until recent history, certain Samaritans living in that part of the world are still identifiable. Now the king of Assyria came on down to Judah, and now Ahaz was dead and his son Hezekiah reigned. And the king of Assyria threatened Hezekiah the king, but Hezekiah proved to be a better man than his father had been. Instead of trying to find a human ally, he ran to God. He sought God's counsel and prayed to God and sought out Isaiah. And Isaiah came to him and said, "Do not fear. The Assyrians will retreat. They will not take Judah." And they didn't. And so Hezekiah goes down as one of the great, more faithful kings in Judah's history. The Assyrians were defeated thereafter by the Babylonians and no more to be a threat. But Hezekiah, because of his pride, showed off his treasures of his house and the house of the Lord to a visiting delegation from Babylon. And when God heard this, he sent his prophet to the king and said, "Why did you show these men these things?" And Hezekiah said, "Because they came to honor me when I was sick." God said, "Because you've done this, then someday the Babylonians will carry your land away as well." After Hezekiah, there came Josiah, who was the last great king of Judah. Josiah sought to bring a revival in Israel, or in Judah. At this time, Jeremiah was living and was one of the great prophets of that era. Josiah was a sincere, godly man. He had the temple cleaned. It hadn't been cleaned out in centuries, evidently. And in the cleaning, they found a lost book of the law, which probably was the book of Deuteronomy, which we will be looking at tomorrow. He sought to bring the people to peace with God, and the people went along with Josiah. They pretended to be converted and have true reformation. God in his mercy had Josiah killed, so he would not live to see that the people had only pretended. As soon as he was dead, they turned away from God again. Jeremiah the prophet rebuked them, saying, "Even in the days of Josiah, you come to me only in pretense, but your heart is far from me." Now Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, comes up against Jerusalem. He threatens, he warns, and finally he overthrows Jerusalem and the kingdom of Judah. And so the history of the two kingdoms comes to a sad end. Yet, at the end of this, we're told that the king of Babylon, not Nebuchadnezzar but another, raised up one of the earlier captured kings of Judah named Jehoiachin, who had been a better king than most of the ones in those latter years. And he gave him a place in the king's table and honored him as a kind of token from God that God had not forgotten his people. Most of them were carried away that were left. They were carried away to Babylon as captives. Among them were people like Daniel and Ezekiel, great men of God, whom God would use to minister to the people that were in Babylon, his people. But for 70 years, the kingdom would lie in desolation. Never again would the kingdom of Judah or the kingdom of Israel arise. From then on till Jesus came, they would be under the heel of one mighty power or another. After the Babylonians, it would be the Persians. After the Persians, it would be the Greeks. And after the Greeks, it would be the Romans, until Jesus, the King of Kings, came and established his own great kingdom. So we see that God's promise to David that you will never cease to have a kingdom on your throne was valid in the sense not that the old kingdoms of Israel and Judah would survive, but that the descendant of David, the true king, would rule, and his kingdom would be an everlasting kingdom. Now, it will be on this historical background then that we will come back in the next hour and look at some of the messages of the prophets of that era. But let us contemplate again some of the lessons that we may apply to our own hearts. We found Solomon a man who would compromise his faith to make alliances with the world. Are we tempted to do this in our daily life, to compromise with the world and compromise our faith in order to get rewards or promotions or business from those of the world? Do we, like Solomon, ever honor ourselves over God? Spend more time on the things that please us than we do on the things that please God. Spend more money for our pleasures than we do giving to God and his work. Do we, like Solomon, honor self over God? Do we, unlike Solomon, take seriously God's warnings in his word? Solomon heard the warnings of God over and over, and yet he did not give heed. Do we? Do we, like Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, seek advice from the wrong people simply because we don't like what God's word has to say? Do we seek advice from people whose lives obviously do not seek to follow the will of God, rather than go to those we know who are wise in the Word of God? Are we, like Elijah, bold to speak the truth for God's sake? Elijah would walk in and speak to the king and say what was true. Are we that bold even to go and speak to a neighbor and say what's true? Have we learned to trust the Word of God rather than miracles? Or do we often find ourselves wanting some kind of reassurance from God, some kind of a sign, maybe a miracle, something that God will do to reassure us that He's with us. Do we, like Elijah, sometimes feel alone in the spiritual warfare? More than once, Elijah felt like he was the only one left, that there was nobody that stood with him against the paganism of that day. Do we ever feel that way? And if so, how do we respond? Have we again, like Jehoshaphat, allied ourselves with faithless people because they flattered us, because they've said something nice about us? Then have we in some way compromised our life by linking up with them, as Jehoshaphat did in his alliances with Ahab? Have we learned to show hospitality to God's servants as that woman did to Elisha? She offered him a room, a bed, a candle, a desk, meager things, but she offered them out of love. Do we understand that there are many of God's servants moving about in this world, and that God has taught us not only here but in John 3, in 3 John, very clearly, that God is pleased when we are hospitable to His servants? Are we ever greedy for the world's treasures, as the servant of Elisha was, Gehazi, so that we are willing even to lie while pretending to be a servant of God, willing to lie to get something of the treasures and rewards of this world? Finally, have we learned to trust God when threatened by our enemies, by the world, by Satan in any manner? As we find ourselves in the warfare that Christ has declared on the kingdom of Satan, when we find ourselves in the heat of battle, have we learned to trust in God, or have we looked for human strength? These and many other questions can rightly be asked as we've studied this section.